The pump at the Holloway store sucked air on a Monday morning in November of 1913, and the sound that came up out of it was one nobody in Coldwater County had ever heard from it before. A long, dry rattle like a man clearing his throat in an empty church. Harlan Boyce, who kept the store and held the coal oil agency for the whole valley, worked the handle 4 more times before he would believe it, and when he stopped, the 11 or 12 men standing around his stove stopped talking too, because every one of them had walked in that morning with an empty can swinging from his hand. The tank behind the store had held 500 gallons at the start of October. It held nothing now but a skin of oil in the bottom and a smell. Boyce hung the nozzle back on its hook and said, in the voice a man uses when he wants a thing to sound smaller than it is, that the tank cars would be along directly, that the railroad had a crew on the bridge day and night, and that a sensible man could get by on what he had at home for a week without any great hardship. Nobody argued with him, but when they went out to their wagons, they all looked the same way, east, down the grade toward the river bottom where the bracken trestle had stood until the water took it, and every man of them was doing the same arithmetic in his head, counting the inches of oil left in his own can against the number of hours the sun would be gone every single day between then and the middle of January. Coldwater County was a long county, narrow and deep, folded in between 2 ridges, and the branch line came into it over exactly 1 bridge. Everything the county could not grow came in over that bridge, and everything it sold went out the same way, and for as long as anybody could remember, that had been a fine arrangement and a cheap one. The bracken trestle was a wooden pile bridge on stone piers, put in when the branch was built, patched and sistered and redecked a dozen times over the years, and it had stood through every high water anybody could name. What took it was not one flood, but the shape of that October. It rained the last 4 days of September, and it rained 11 days out of the first 16 in October. A slow soaking rain that never came hard enough to frighten anybody, and by the last week of the month the ground on both ridges would not take another drop, and every draw and every dry run was carrying water. Then the wind came around into the southwest, and it rained warm for a night and a day, and the Sable River, which had been running high and brown and patient, came up 9 feet between supper and daylight, and came down out of the hills carrying half the dead timber in the north end of the county. The men who saw it said the drift hit the trestle in a raft the size of a hayfield. 2 of the piers went, and when the piers went, the deck folded into the water and went down the river in pieces, and the rails hung out over the gap in 2 long silver curves that shivered in the current for an hour before they parted. In the morning there was no bridge. There was a stone pier standing in brown water with nothing on it, and a track that ran to the edge of the fill and stopped, and a section boss standing at the end of the ties with his hat in his hand. The railroad said 6 weeks. The railroad, as it turned out, needed 9, because the new steel was on order from a mill that had orders ahead of it, and because the high water stayed up into the middle of November and would not let the crews get at the footings. 9 weeks does not sound like a great deal until you set it down on a calendar and see where it falls. It fell across the shortest days of the year. In that country, the sun cleared the east ridge a little before 8 in the morning and went behind the west ridge a little after 4 in the afternoon, and in cloudy weather it did not properly arrive at all. Every farm in the county did its milking twice a day in the dark. Every farm did its feeding in the dark, and its watering, and its wood splitting. Butchering came in the cold weather, and butchering is work that runs past dark by its nature. The school kept until 4. Church was of an evening. The doctor did not choose his hours. All of that, every hour of it, ran on coal oil, and coal oil came in over the bracken trestle in tank cars and in no other way at all. There was one woman in Coldwater County who had been getting ready for those 9 weeks for 19 years, and the whole county had been laughing at her the entire time. Her name was Orpha Sturgis, and she was 68 years old that autumn, a plain, square-built woman with a face the sun had worked on, and iron-gray hair she pulled back so tight it looked painted on. She had been a widow since 1894. She farmed 120 acres on the ridge above Holloway with a hired man in the busy weeks and nobody at all the rest of the year, and by any honest reckoning she farmed it well. Her fences stood. Her barn had a sound roof and a clean floor and a granary that was never empty in March. She was not poor, and she was not rich, and she had never in her life owed the store more than she could pay in the same month. A woman in her 60s who runs a ridge farm alone and keeps it out of debt is not, ordinarily, a figure of fun. What made her one was the wash house. Alvin Sturgis had married her out of a town 40 miles east and brought her up onto that ridge in 1876. And Alvin's mother had been a tallow chandler's daughter and had taught the trade to her son the way another woman might have taught him to graft apples. It was not a living. It had not been a living even then. But Alvin had kept the kettle and the frames and the rods in the stone wash house behind the kitchen, and every November after the butchering he had rendered tallow and dipped candles, partly because his mother had, and partly because he liked doing a thing with his hands that came out the same every time. By 1894 there was not a house left in Coldwater County that burned a candle for light, and that is a plain matter of record and not an exaggeration. Coal oil had come in over the branch line cheap and clean and steady for a dozen years. Every store in the valley kept a barrel of it, a good lamp cost $2 and a chimney cost a dime, and a candle had become a thing people spoke of when they were describing their grandmothers. Households kept a few ends in a drawer against a broken chimney, and that was all. The year the county quit candles altogether was the same year Alvin Sturgis died, and Orpha noticed that and never mentioned it to anybody. When he died in the spring of 1894 of a thing in his chest that took him in 11 days, Orpha did what widows on ridge farms do, which is to say she got up the next morning and went out and did the chores. And that November, with the leaves down and the first hogs killed, she went out to the stone wash house and lit the fire under her husband's kettle and rendered 140 pounds of tallow and dipped candles for 2 weeks. She was 49 years old, and she told her daughter that she only wanted the smell of it in the house one more time. She was still doing it when she was 68. The wash house was a low stone building with a slate roof and a chimney at the north end, and it was the coolest, driest building on the place. In it there was a rendering kettle that held 40 gallons set in a brick arch with a firebox under it. There was a long trough of cold water. There were 3 dipping frames, which are wooden racks a woman can walk around, and 80-some dipping rods, which are nothing but smooth sticks a yard long. And on each rod hung 24 wicks, with a lead weight tied to the bottom of each one so it would hang straight. She spun her own wicking on a little wheel out of cotton she bought by the bolt at the store, which was the only part of the business Harlan Boyce made any money on, and the only part he never mentioned. Under the wash house was a stone cellar, dug into the ridge and lined and vaulted, cold in July and never freezing in January, and along its walls stood shelves her husband had built, and on the shelves stood wooden boxes packed with clean sawdust, and in the sawdust lay candles. Tallow candles, made right and kept cold and dark and dry, will lie in a box for 20 years and burn as well at the end of it as the week they were dipped. Hers were made right. There was a reason she had begun, and there was a reason she went on, and they were not the same reason. The reason she went on was a January night in 1881, 13 years before she was widowed at all, when the ice went out early and took the first bracken trestle, the one before the one the flood took, and the store was 5 weeks without oil in the deepest part of that winter. On the 9th night of it, a boy named Tobias Culp, who was 11 and was the middle child of a family that farmed the bottom below the Sturgis place, got his arm into a corn sheller. His father carried him 1.5 miles to the house, and they laid him on the kitchen table, and somebody rode for the doctor, and the doctor came, and there was in the whole Culp house 1 lamp with about 1 inch of oil in it and 4 candle ends. Orpha Sturgis was 35 that winter, and she was in that kitchen because she was the nearest neighbor, and because she had hands. She stood at the head of the table for 4 hours, holding a lamp that guttered and browned and finally quit. And then she stood holding a candle end in each hand, and when those went, she stood holding a splinter of fat pine that smoked so badly the doctor had to work with his eyes streaming. The boy lived. He lived, and he kept the arm. And he grew up to farm the same bottom and to be a heavy-shouldered man who took off his hat to her on the road for the rest of her life. But she had stood there in the middle of the night in a hot kitchen, watching a good doctor try to do fine work by a light that kept going out, and she had understood something in her bones that she was never afterward able to argue anybody else into understanding. Light is not a convenience. Light is a supply, exactly like flour is a supply and salt is a supply. And a county that keeps no more of it on hand than will get it to Saturday is a county that has decided to gamble. That was the whole of her philosophy, and she never dressed it up any better than that. She said it once or twice in the early years, and then she quit saying it. Because saying it made people laugh, and she was not a woman who enjoyed being laughed at. So instead of saying it, she just went out to the wash house every November and made light and put it in a cellar. And the county laughed anyway. It laughed comfortably and without much malice for the first few years, the way a county laughs at any old-fashioned thing, and then it settled into a habit, the way a county will. She was the candle woman. That was the whole joke, and it did not need any more to it than that. In 1898, the store put in the big tank behind the building and a pump on the platform, and Harlan Boyce, who had come into the store from his father and who was a genial man with a loud voice and a talent for making a crowd agree with him, made a small speech about it. And in the speech he said that there was one household on the ridge that would not be needing the pump, and everybody in the store laughed, and Orpha Sturgis was standing at the dry goods counter with her back to them buying wicking cotton. She did not turn around. She paid for the cotton, and she went out and got in her wagon. That was the first time, and it was not the last, and after a while it stopped being an event and became a sort of weather. She would come in for wicking in September, and one of the men at the stove would ask her, loud enough to carry, whether she was laying in for the next war, and she would say she supposed she was, and they would laugh, and she would put her parcel under her arm and go. She got so she came in on Wednesdays because there were fewer of them there on Wednesdays. There were other days that stayed with her. At the county fair in 1904, she entered 24 of her heavy dips in the household exhibits because a woman on the committee had asked her to, and the judges gave her a blue ribbon, and the man reading the awards read out the class as candles. Comma, homemade, and paused, and the crowd under the tent laughed for a good while before he could go on, and she took her ribbon off the table and put it in her handbag and did not enter anything at that fair again for 9 years. At a church supper the winter after that, one of the deacons stood up and made a toast to the widow Sturgis and the light of the world, and half the room thought it was funny, and the other half looked at their plates, and the deacon's wife apologized to her at the door, and Orpha said there was no need, and then walked home 2 miles in the cold rather than ride with anybody. Her grandson came home from the Holloway school one spring and asked her, with a child's flat honesty, whether it was true that she was saving up for the end of the world, and she said no, she was saving up for a Tuesday. And the boy did not understand that until he was a grown man with a farm of his own. It cost her, and that is the part nobody counted, because from the outside a hobby looks free. Tallow is not free. In an ordinary year she bought the leaf fat and the trimmings from 6 or 8 butcherings, and she paid cash money for them, 3 cents a pound and sometimes 4, and there were years she rendered 1,100 pounds. Wicking cotton is not free. Firewood is not free, and a rendering kettle under a full boil will eat 1.5 quarts in a season. And the largest cost was the one that never appeared anywhere, which is that a woman of 68 who spends the last 3 weeks of November and the first 2 of December in a stone wash house from before daylight until after dark is a woman who is not doing 7 other things. Her son-in-law put a figure on it once. Cleve Marlin had married her daughter Verna and farmed the next place east, and Cleve was not a cruel man, only a tidy one. And it embarrassed him to have a mother-in-law who was a standing joke at the store where he traded. He sat at her kitchen table one December and worked it out on the back of a seed catalog, the tallow and the wood and the cotton and the days, and he made it come to better than $200 a year, and he told her, kindly, that she had put a good team of horses into that cellar. She looked at the figures for a while and said that she supposed she had. Then she got up and put more wood in the stove. Verna cried about it in the buggy going home, and Cleve said nothing more about it for 2 years. Year after year she kept on. She dipped in 1900 and in 1901 and in every year after. She dipped the November her hip went bad, and she dipped the November after the hail took her corn, sitting on a stool to do it with the frames pulled close. She gave candles away at Christmas until people started leaving them on the shelf, and then she quit giving them away and just put them in the cellar. Twice she thought about stopping. The second time was the autumn of 1911, when Cleve and Verna sat her down about it again, and Verna said the thing that hurt, which was that people were beginning to say the old woman was not right. And Orpha sat with her hands in her lap for a while, and then said that she would think about it. She thought about it all through the butchering. Then she went out to the wash-house and lit the fire. By the autumn of 1913 there were 430 boxes on the shelves in that cellar and something over 26,000 candles in the boxes. And there was not another candle for sale within 60 miles, and every soul in Coldwater County who thought about it at all thought about it as the saddest waste of a good woman's time in the whole valley. The first week after the trestle went, nobody worried. The store had oil in the tank, and Boyce sold it as usual and told everybody the 6-week figure with confidence. The second week he began to sell it a gallon at a time to a customer, which he explained was only fairness, and the men at the stove agreed that it was only fairness and went home and told their wives to burn 1 lamp instead of 2. The third week he sold it a quart at a time, and there was no more talk about fairness. And on that Monday morning in November, the pump sucked air. And by Wednesday, there was not a gallon of coal oil for sale in Coldwater County, and would not be for the better part of 9 weeks. The oil cars stopped where the rails stopped. There were 4 of them standing loaded on a siding at the junction, 60 miles east, full of the light that Valley ran on, and they sat there through December because there was no way on earth to get them across the Sable River, and nobody had ever built a road that could carry them. What a county does when the light fails is go backward through its own history very quickly. In the first days, people burned what they had and sat up later out of nervousness and used it faster than they meant to. In the second week, they were making grease lamps, which is a saucer of hog fat with a twist of rag laid in it. And a grease lamp gives about as much light as a lightning bug and smells like a burnt supper for 2 days afterward. Men went up on the ridges and split fat pine and brought it down in bundles, and pine knots will light a room, but they throw soot that gets into everything, and they are not a thing you can carry into a barn with any peace of mind. 3 barns burned in Coldwater County that winter, and every one of them burned because somebody was doing chores by an open flame he should not have been carrying. Families went to bed at 6 because there was nothing else to do, and lay awake and got up cross. The Vance store at the crossroads sold out of playing cards and sold out of matches. A woman down in the bottom finished a quilt top she had started before her wedding, because a quilt top is a thing you can piece by feel at a window. Old people who had been dreading the winter anyway stopped going out of the house at all after 3 in the afternoon, and 2 of them fell on their own steps in the dark, and one of those did not get up again. The mail carrier ran his route by daylight and quit taking the long loop past the Renner place because he could not finish it and see his way home. And the men who had spent 19 years telling one another that a candle was a thing your grandmother burned were, by the middle of that second week, cutting up their wives' bacon rind and floating rag wicks in it, and knowing perfectly well what they were doing, and not one of them said the obvious thing out loud in front of the others, because in a county that size a man knows exactly which words he will not be allowed to take back. school let out at 2:30, and then at 2, and then the trustees talked about closing it until the bridge was in. The Wednesday prayer meeting was given up. The store shut its doors at 4. Butchering, which is the one job in the year that absolutely cannot wait and absolutely cannot be done well in poor light, came on in the first week of December, and men were scalding hogs by lantern light with a lantern turned down to a thread to save it, and there were more cut hands in that county in 10 days than in the previous 10 years. On the 4th of December, Ardith Pell, who taught the Holloway School and boarded with the Boyces, walked 2 miles up the Ridge Road after school in the cold because she had run out of every other idea. She had 11 pupils, and it was dark in her schoolroom by 3, and she had exactly 1 lamp with about a 1/4 inch in the bowl, and she had been holding class in a half circle at the window for a week. She stood on the porch of the Sturgis house and said she did not know if it was even a true thing, but she had heard for years that there were candles up here. Orpha Sturgis put her shawl on and got the key to the cellar off the nail by the stove and took a lantern and walked out through the washhouse and down the 6 stone steps. And Ardith Pell came down behind her and stopped on the bottom step, and the lantern went up, and the whole vault came out of the shadow at once, shelf after shelf, box after box. 430 boxes packed in sawdust from the floor to the arch of the ceiling on both sides and along the end wall, and the light picked up the pale ends of the candles in the open boxes so that the walls of that cellar looked like the inside of a honeycomb. The schoolteacher did not say anything for a while. Then she said, in a voice that had gone thin, that she would take a dozen. Orpha Sturgis put 200 in a crate and set it in the schoolteacher's arms and said the school was not going to sit in the dark for a dozen candles. She would not take money for those. But she stood in the cellar for a long while after the young woman had gone up the steps, and what she was doing was arithmetic, because she was not a sentimental woman and she knew exactly what was coming up that lane in the morning. She sat at the kitchen table that night with a pencil and worked out what a candle cost her to make, tallow and wick and wood and the wear on things, and she made it a shade under 1.5 cents. She thought about what she could get. She was not a fool, and she knew precisely what she was holding, which was the only light in a county that had no other. In December, with the bridge 9 weeks out, and if she had asked a dime apiece, there were men in that valley who would have paid it and thanked her. She wrote down 3 cents and looked at it a long time and did not change it. 3 cents for a plain dip, 5 for the heavy long ones that would burn 10 hours, and no more than 4 dozen to any one household until she saw how it went, so that a man with money could not come down the lane at daylight and clear her out and sell them again on his own porch by supper. She wrote that on a piece of paper and tacked it on the wash-house door and went to bed. They came at daylight. The first wagon in the lane was Tobias Culp's, the boy from the corn sheller, 43 years old now and farming his father's bottom, and he did not say much of anything. He just stood in the wash-house with his hat off while she counted out 4 dozen into a flour sack. By 9 o'clock there were 9 wagons in the lane, and by noon the line went from her gate down the Ridge Road past the corner of her cornfield, and she had brought the kitchen table out into the wash-house and set her daughter Verna behind it with the account book. Some of the men who came up that lane had been at the stove in the store for 19 years. A few of them made a joke of it as they came in, the sort of joke a man makes to get out ahead of a thing, and she took their money and thanked them and never once in the entire winter said a word about it to any of them. That was noticed. In a county that size, a thing like that is noticed more than a hard word would have been. By the 5th day she had sold better than 9,000 candles, and she could see the far wall of the cellar for the first time in 9 years, and she understood that the stock she had spent 19 years laying up was going to be gone before Christmas, and the bridge was not going to be in before the middle of January. So she did the thing that turned a curiosity into an industry. She sent word down to the store and to both churches and to the Crossroads advances that she would buy fat. Any fat. Leaf fat, gut fat, trimmings, cracklings, the scraps off the butchering table, The tubs of stuff that in an ordinary December went into the hog trough or over the bank into the creek because it was not worth a man's time to do anything else with it, and she would pay 4 cents a pound, cash, at her own door, for every pound of it in Coldwater County. It was butchering season. There was more waste fat within 6 miles of Holloway that December than in any other 3 weeks of the year. And so, for a fortnight, the Ridge Road carried a traffic that people in that county talked about for the rest of their lives, which was farm wagons coming up the hill loaded with wash tubs and lard cans and barrels of the exact material those same farms had been throwing away since their grandfathers broke the sod, hauling it to the old woman they had been laughing at, and going back down the hill with candles and cash money both. She hired 8 women and girls from the neighborhood at $1.25 a day, which was better than any woman's wage in that county, and put 3 of them on the rendering and 5 on the frames. She ran the kettle from 4 in the morning until 9 at night. She had all 3 dipping frames going and rigged a 4th out of the hay ladder. A rod of 24 wicks goes down into the tallow and comes up and hangs and cools and goes down again, 20, 25, 30 times, and the candle grows on the wick a hair's thickness at a pass, and there is no way on this earth to hurry it. So she did not hurry it. She simply never stopped. They dipped through the day and banked the fire at 9 and started it again at 4. There is a rhythm to that work that anybody who has done it will recognize, and nobody who has not can be told. The tallow has to be held at one heat and no other, hot enough to take and cool enough to cling, and the way you know is by the way it looks on the back of a spoon and by the way the first rod comes up, and Orpha Sturgis could tell by the smell alone from across the room when the kettle wanted wood. The rods come off the frame in order and go down and come up and go back on the frame in the same order, and by the 11th pass the wicks are no longer wicks, they are candles the thickness of a pencil, and by the 20th they are the thickness of a thumb. And if a woman on the frames lets her attention go and puts a warm rod back too soon, the whole rod slumps and has to be cut off and rendered over. She lost 2 rods the first day and not one after that. The girls learned it in a morning. The rendering side was harder and dirtier work, 3 women standing over an open kettle skimming cracklings with long paddles in a room where the air itself was greasy. And she paid those 3 a quarter a day more than the others and told them why, in front of the others, so there would be no talk about it. The Stonewash house on that ridge ran warm and full of light for 6 weeks, and neighbors said that coming up the road in the black of 5 in the morning, you could see the glow of that doorway from a mile off, the only lit building on the whole ridge, with the shadows of women moving back and forth across it. Dr. Miriam Alt came up on the 2nd Sunday in December and bought 300 and told her, standing in the doorway with the sleet coming down behind him, about the Renner baby that had been born crooked at 2 in the morning on the Tuesday before, and how he had worked for an hour and 40 minutes on that kitchen table with 4 of her heavy candles burning in a row of tin reflectors that the child's grandmother had rigged out of pie plates, and how both of them had come through it. He was not a demonstrative man. He said it the way he would have read out a weather report. But he had ridden 4 miles in sleet on a Sunday to say it, and he bought his 300 and paid for them and would not take the discount she tried to give him. The railroad came next, which surprised her. The bridge crew was working 2 shifts on the trestle, and the second shift ran until midnight in a river bottom in December, and the road's own lanterns were burning oil the road could not spare, and the section boss came up the lane in a hired rig and bought 2,000 candles for the pier work and the tool shed and the bunk car at the depot, and came back 9 days later and bought 2,000 more. He paid with a company voucher that the bank at the county seat honored the same week. After the railroad, it was the county. The board met on the 16th of December in a courthouse that had been closing its offices at 3:30 for a month, and the clerk laid it out plainly that there were 4 schools and a courthouse and a jail and a poor farm in Coldwater County, and not one of them had a light in it, and the board voted in open session with better than 40 people in the room to contract with Orpha Sturgis of Holloway for the county's light through the last week of January. It is worth understanding what that meant in a place like that. It was read out in the minutes, and it was printed in the Coldwater Register the following Thursday with her name in it, and that paper went into every house in the valley. There were men who had been telling the same joke about that woman for 19 years who had to sit at their own supper tables and hear their wives read out the county board's contract with the candlewoman. Harlan Boyce came up the ridge on the 20th of December. He came in his own buggy, and he came in the middle of the day, which everybody understood, because a man who comes at dusk is hoping not to be seen. He had a store with 300 customers and empty shelves, and he had been telling those customers for 6 weeks that the cars would be along directly. He stood in the door of that wash house with his hat held against his chest, a heavy man in a long white apron under his overcoat, with the steam and the tallow smell rolling out past him into the cold, and there were 9 or 10 people in that yard who saw it, including 2 of the men who had been at his stove the morning the pump sucked air. He asked her, in front of every one of them, whether she would sell to the store. He did not make a speech about it. Whatever else he was not stupid, and he knew what he was standing in. She said she would. She sold Harlan Boyce 4,000 candles at 3 cents apiece over the next 4 weeks, and he retailed them at 5 and made his own honest margin on them, and neither of them ever discussed the year 1898. But she wrote it in the book, in her own hand, the way she wrote everything, and Verna said afterward that her mother's writing did not so much as waver on the line. The steel came the 2nd week of January, and the road put the last stringers in on a Thursday and ran a work train across on the Saturday, and the first tank car came into the Holloway Depot on the 19th of January to a crowd, and there were men who cheered it. The pump ran again. And what surprised everybody, including Orpha Sturgis, was that the candles did not stop selling. They slowed, but they did not stop. Every household in that valley had spent 9 weeks learning the difference between having light and having light on hand, and a good many of them had decided quietly that they would keep a box of the old woman's dips in the cellar from now on, the way they kept a barrel of flour. She was still filling orders in March. Verna footed the account book at the kitchen table in the last week of February, with Cleve sitting across from her, and when she came to the bottom of it she read the figure out twice, because she did not trust it the first time. After the tallow was paid for, and the wicking, and the wood, and the 8 women's wages for 6 weeks, and the 2 frames she had ruined, and the kettle she had cracked and had to have braised at the county seat, the widow Sturgis had cleared $6,240 between the 4th of December and the last day of February. It was more money than that farm had made in the previous 11 years put together. It was more than the farm was worth. Cleve Marlin, who 19 years before had sat at that same table and worked out on the back of a seed catalog that she was throwing away $200 a year, sat and looked at his sister-in-law's handwriting for a while, and then went outside and stood in the yard in his shirt sleeves in February for a good 10 minutes, and when he came back in, he did not say anything about it. And he never said anything about it, and for the rest of his life, if anybody in his hearing started up the old joke at the store, Cleve Marlin got up and walked out. She did not do anything dramatic with the money. She paid the 8 women a second time, a full extra wage each, in cash, in an envelope, which was the only thing she did that winter that made her cry. And she did that in her own kitchen with the door shut. She put a new roof on the Holloway schoolhouse and had a proper cloakroom built onto the north side of it, and she never once let it be called a gift. She called it a trade and said the school had kept her books straight in December, which was not true. And everybody knew it was not true. She bought $400 worth of coal oil in the spring and put it in a stone shed she had built for the purpose at the corner of her lot, and told the county board that it was there and where the key hung. She bought 160 acres of bottom land from the Renner estate and rented it to Tobias Culp on shares for the rest of her life at a rent everybody agreed was too low. And in the November following, she went out to the stone wash house and lit the fire under her husband's kettle at 4 a.m, exactly as she had done every November for 20 years, and rendered her tallow and hung her rods and dipped. She was 69 by then and stiff in the hip, and she did the first 3 days sitting on a stool. But she was not out there alone. There were 14 women and girls in that wash house before the first week was out, and by the second week there were wagons coming up the Ridge Road with tubs of butchering fat on them, because it had somehow become the plain understanding of Coldwater County that fat went up the hill in November, and there was a boy from the register who came out with a camera and made a picture of the whole. Crowd of them standing in the wash house door with the steam pouring out overhead. That picture hung in the Holloway store for 30 years, on the wall behind the stove, about 4 feet from where the men had sat. Harlan Boyce hung it there himself, and when strangers asked him about it, he told the story straight, including his own part in it, which took a kind of courage that nobody in that valley had expected of him and which they gave him credit for afterward. He was heard to say, more than once, that he had sold light to that county for 15 years and had never once thought about what would happen if the light did not come, and that the difference between him and the woman in the picture was not brains and was not money. It was that she had been in a kitchen one night in 1881 and he had not. Orpha Sturgis lived another 11 years and dipped candles in every one of them, and when she died in the spring, the county closed its offices for the funeral, and they carried her up the Ridge Road past her own cornfield, and there were people in that procession who had walked that same lane in the dark in December of 1913 with an empty can in their hand. The bracken trestle stands yet. They put it in steel that winter, and it has never gone out again. But there is not a family in that valley that came down from that generation which does not keep candles in the house, and if you ask them why, most of them will tell you it is only a habit, and a few of the older ones will tell you the whole thing, and they will start it the same way every time, which is that there was a woman up on the ridge that the whole county laughed at for 19 years.